motion, and particularly acknowledge all of those Vietnamese community leaders, those Vietnamese veterans and those Australian veterans from the RSL who have paid commemoration today on the 50th anniversary of the fall of Saigon. 50 years to the day, a black day on which Saigon fell, a liberal democracy taken over and defeated by a violent, corrupt, authoritarian, totalitarian, communist dictatorship. The motion we are debating acknowledges the trauma of this, and it is good that it does so unambiguously. It is an acknowledgement of the torture, disease and starvation visited upon millions of Vietnamese people, victims of the invasion, victims of so-called re-education camps, people forced to flee as refugees in small boats on deadly, treacherous waters. Today at the commemorative service, attended by a number of members of Parliament, including myself and the Leader of the Opposition, leaders in our community and dozens of veterans from both the Australian and the South Vietnamese services, along with one American serviceman. Also, particularly along with their representatives, we paid tribute to all those who paid the ultimate sacrifice. We acknowledged the mateship and camaraderie felt by Australian and South Vietnamese forces. Today, it was also important to acknowledge some difficult truths. The speeches acknowledged the regret that we now have for the way in which our return service personnel were treated upon their return. The member for Hammond highlighted the gap of more than a decade before there was welcome home acknowledgements on a national scale, for example. They were fighting for our nation. They were fighting for our freedom, our values. Hundreds, more than 500 Australians gave their lives, both conscripted and voluntary services. They deserve the honour, every honour that is given to them. And it was a positive thing today that the Vietnamese community in particular demonstrated their gratitude to these service personnel, dozens of service personnel this morning, with particular acknowledgement. And as members have reflected earlier in this debate, it is incumbent upon us all to ensure their sacrifices are not forgotten, their service is honoured, and the way in which they were maltreated and insignificantly supported upon their return never be repeated. Today in the service, Bill Denny, as a returned Vietnam veteran, also reflected upon the significant regret that was felt by many of the Australian personnel who were serving in Vietnam when the announcement and the order to return to Australia was given. The South Vietnamese forces were understood by many of those personnel, as Bill Denny reflected, being abandoned in many ways to fight their fight alone, without sufficient support, without sufficient resources, without the air equipment, the air defence equipment necessary to enable their continued survival and successful defence of their country, when opposed by not just the North Vietnamese forces, but also by all of the communist bloc countries, the Soviet Union, China, Cuba, other Eastern Bloc countries, as was described, who were supporting the North Vietnamese invading forces. For all of those people who continued to fight for the principles of freedom and democracy, we in this Parliament should also give thanks. And there is a sorrowful and I think a particular trauma as we think of the flame of democracy and democratic liberty being extinguished by a belligerent invading force. 50 years later, our reflection on this trauma should stiffen our sinews and firm our resolve to continue supporting our friends in Ukraine as they continue to fight for liberal democracy and its values against a belligerent invading force. As I laid my wreath this morning, along with the Leader of the Opposition, we did so knowing that our local florist, a Ukrainian migrant, Natasha, had done a magnificent job, and it felt a particularly salient moment. The second part of this motion, sir, is equally important and perhaps a more cheerful note on which to end, because as we do commiserate 50 years and commemorate 50 years since the fall of Saigon, we can at least celebrate the 50 years that the Vietnamese community in South Australia has had such a remarkable impact upon all of our lives. And it is unthinkable to imagine South Australia today without the extraordinary contribution made by so many Vietnamese migrants, so many of whom came as refugees in extraordinarily difficult circumstances in the late 1970s. As a Liberal, I am so proud of the work done by former Liberal Prime Minister, the late Malcolm Fraser, who made that active choice that we would welcome and support those refugees coming to Australia. It was virtuous, it was righteous, and ultimately it was a decision that has been in our country's interests and in the interests of our state. Because every time that I go to a Vietnamese community event, I'm overwhelmed first by the sense of gratitude that that community feels, the songs that have been written. And again, Quinn Tran, as the president of the Vietnamese community in South Australia this morning, read us a rewritten version of Dorothea McKellar's Sunburnt Country with the words about the gratitude of the Vietnamese community integrated into its text. But every time I hear one of these statements, and they are invariably at almost every one of these events, I'm overwhelmed by the sense that we are more fortunate as South Australians to have the Vietnamese community here. It is a positive thing that for the tens of thousands of South Australians of Vietnamese background or birth, they are able to live safe and free in this country and indeed make that extraordinary contribution to our state. So it's important, therefore, for our state, may we always provide a safe home for them and their families, where they may prosper and achieve as they have done, and where the sacrifices and losses of them and their forebears will not be forgotten, lest we forget.